This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Ever wondered what it's like to go through life having no childhood, with a brain that has almost completely rewired itself? In this podcast series, I will explore some of the ways adults with childhood traumatic brain injuries experience life through a unique lens and what makes them so magically distinct in this world of ours. I'm Leanne Barnett. Welcome to Headstrong, a life with traumatic brain injury. Back in 2006, Cathy Matthews was a part of a group who set up Brain Injury Otago. For the last 18 years, numerous people have been blessed with her remarkable, dogged, and at times life-saving support, myself included. This year, her role shifted, and she is now focusing on education. Her story, her roles, her achievement and successes are numerous and need an episode of their own. So today, I want to go in a slightly different direction. I want to mine Cathy's knowledge and experience from a more personal perspective. That is that of a parent who has a child who sustained a traumatic brain injury when they were a child, and what that has been like to support them over the last 3 to 4 decades. All too often, the focus is on those who sustain brain injuries, and families are completely neglected. So kia ora, Cathy. Welcome to the podcast. First up, tell us your story.
Kia ora, Leanne. It's great to be here. Well, going back to 1986, I had a child that was 5 years old, beautiful little blonde-haired child, and they got hit by a car. And they sustained a severe brain injury into intensive care and in a coma for a number of weeks, loss of post-traumatic amnesia for about 8 weeks. I spent about 8 weeks in hospital, and then they were discharged to home where they were felt to be better off. And we used to travel, because we lived rurally, we used to travel every day to Dunedin Public Hospital, which was now each way, for rehabilitation, which in those days was quite intense, as you yourself, or you won't remember, but the learning to breathe and sit and hold your head up and walk and talk had come in, most of it had come in before the discharge. And that the learning to walk very much and the talking was afterwards as well. And that so we did that, for nearly a year, every single day, traipsed through to the Dunedin Public Hospital. And that it was a pretty big commitment for all of us as a family. We had one other child at that stage, and while he was in intensive care, I found out that I was expecting again. And so that was a bit of a shock to the system.
Huge shock. So we can't really focus on your child's adult years until we look at how the impact of injuries were for you as a parent and as for the whānau was. So do you want to give us a bit of a rundown?
Right. So like everybody out there, there's so many people that are quite unaware of brain injury and the impacts that it can have on a person. And so very much I thought what we saw is what we got. But in actual fact, I didn't understand that this brain injury was permanent and going to be there for life. It impacted on us hugely, impacted on every hour of our day, to be exact, and had problems sleeping. So you can imagine having a newborn baby and trying to manage that sleep pattern. In actual fact, the baby was not a problem. The baby was a gift from God and slept beautifully. But it was the person with the injury that had the problem. It impacted on everything we did socially, everything we did as a family. We would have humongous behavioural issues, and no one there to explain to us what was going on or to assist us. The impact on school, relationships, was impacted.
So I guess, how did that strain those relationships within your whānau, your family, and with your friends and your community groups, like schools, whatnot?
Well, and we'll look at family first. I mean, that the child looked, after they were able to walk and talk again, they looked just like normal, but they weren't. And there are some people within the family that didn't necessarily understand that. That's not their fault. It's just the lack of information about brain injury and the impacts out there. And that that made it very difficult, because when we were out socially, it impacted on our relationships and being able to interact with other people, and things went wrong, lash out physically, and that's not acceptable. And many a time we had to leave a social occasion and I'd be in tears and bundling them all into the car and whatever else. And so that was the same at school. But in the school situation, that was very misunderstood. And I used to be told, he doesn't look any different than anyone else. But they didn't seem to, even the clinical, they weren't clinical psychologists, they were education psychologists. They didn't really understand. And I felt really let down by them. And then the wider community, again, just like family, they saw them back out in the community taking part in activities, and 2 or 3 years down the track, they didn't remember at a school sports day, when there would be an incident where just taking off in a running race, and somebody jostled them, they'd lose balance, and so then they get up and go charging after this kid, ready to tackle him to the ground, and the principal's running after them, and they're trying to contain that situation. And people just didn't relate that to the brain injury that had happened a couple of years beforehand.
I remember more from my teen years, people saying to me, it's been a while now, you should be over it and you should be fine. Did you get that a lot from people when referring to your child? Yes, I definitely did. And when people ask me now, what do you do? Well, you had your child many years ago, didn't you? And I said, yep, that's right. And I said, that is what got me into it. But, you hear it repeatedly. So what was the notable differences between your child that has the brain injury and your child without the brain injury during those early years? Well, initially, the 5-year-old was believed to have regressed back to about a 2-year-old, and the other child was 3. So even though I had a 5 and a 3-year-old, I actually had a 3 and a 2-year-old. And that was very obvious in the development, the social abilities and interactions that you would expect from children as they're learning through their developing years. So very quickly, the 3-year-old passed I don't know that the 5-year-old ever got to the same reading level. So it was always like, doing homework was always about keeping them apart, because the one 2 years younger would always be screeds ahead of the other person. And so to ensure that there was no fights and that you were continually trying to balance that so that they still felt good about themselves, their behaviours were very much there. The ability to actually reason and judgment were there. One child learnt by consequences. The other child with the brain injury has no insight. No insight at all. So can we go to that word insight? Can you explain to people what that means? Well, the child has no understanding of consequences of their actions. And so, we used to say, you're not to do this because this is going to put you at risk, blah, blah, blah. And then they'd turn around and do it straight away. And we thought we just had a naughty child. We didn't understand about this lack of insight at this stage.
But it was very much obvious that the younger child could be responsible. The older child with the brain injury could not be responsible because they didn't understand the consequences of any of their actions. And so disciplining as a parent as well, if you take something away, well, that doesn't mean anything. They just move on to something else. And, it's very, very difficult, even as an adult.
That must have had a massive emotional impact on you and your husband.
Yes.
What was that?
Very, very much so. My husband and I were very lucky right from the early days in hospital. We decided, we made a conscious effort to pull together. And, I would often hear him say, "Come on, Mother, we've got worse on our plate. We just need to work through this," and we'd pull together. It did put a lot of pressure on our relationship. Yeah, I think it made us stronger that we did pull together. The not understanding what was ahead of us, I think, made it very, very difficult.
So you talked about living rurally. How did this relate to the services that you received versus the services that you would have received had you have lived somewhere like, say, Dunedin, where it's bigger and there is more?
Well, there was no services locally for us. So any service that we had to have, we had to travel for. And so that was, taking into account the fatigue that goes with brain injury. We had a car big enough so that our child could lie in the back seat. This was in the days before seatbelts. and we had to plan everything around that fatigue. So it would be a big day where we'd be away on the road by 8:30, drop the other child at school and then on the road. And a big commitment from my husband because being pregnant myself, I had to try and manage my fatigue and stay at home often with our other child. So the rurally, I think if things had been nice and local, it would have been so much easier for us. And I think we weren't well supported by ACC, unfortunately. They closed the file within 12 months of the injury. That was the end of it, so to speak. So anything we got, we had to fight for. We had some very good people in the public hospital.
I remember my parents having to go through, or am aware now that my parents had to go through something very similar in terms of lack of supports in that time period. So
yeah.
I hear you. Talking about supports, what were the most helpful forms of supports that you received from your friends, your family, your community?
I think friends, family, friends and family, just to have some close people around you. And I did have you only need a couple, and that they see you through thick and thin. Community. They were always supportive because I was part of a community, but because of the behavioural issues, it was always seen as a behaviour and a naughty child rather than the brain injury. So there was a bit of looking down your nose, so to speak.
Were you able to talk to them and try and say, this is what is happening?
Not really, because I didn't necessarily know. And, I remember being at Play Centre one day and there was a psychologist coming to speak to the parents. And I was pretty desperate at this stage. And I was like a zombie. And I remember going along there and speaking to him. And he must have been so concerned because he came around and visited me at home afterwards and gave me some ideas. So I just think, for him to have done that, he must have realised the need. But that was my first time of reaching out.
Well, that's what the next kind of question, I guess, is what would have been helpful, and that leads into that psychologist coming to talk to you.
So what would have been helpful? So the injury happened at 5, so I think it was around 9 or 10. We had major issues in the school system. We had major behavioural issues at home, and we finally saw a neuropsychologist, Dr. Barry Longmore, who did a support.
The most amazing man.
Yes, and you know, I'm always very grateful to Barry because he let me know that I wasn't just a bad mum, that they had an organic brain injury, and that just meant so much. And he started putting the pieces in for me, and so that was the start of turning it around for me. And previously I had tried to get some information about brain injury, but in New Zealand in those days there was no internet. I went to the library and they went off to the National Library and did a request, and I got a textbook and I got a little journal written by a mother in the States, and that was all for the whole of New Zealand.
And it told you nothing, I bet you.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. The next thing I want to know is, what are the specific instances that you experienced where you found professionals weren't helpful?
Well, I think I would have to say that, one, the GPs, okay, very much so. They seem to lack information, and so therefore they just didn't engage around the brain injury, and could be even judgmental about the behavioural issues. And I think the other thing, we had a lot of professionals through in those early years, through our lives, and not one of them said this is not good enough. You know, something needs to be done here. We had everyone doing their jobs individually, and no one really looked at us as them as an injury or us as a family.
I experienced that too, where I've had multiple different therapeutic supports or habilitation, and every single one of them works independently. No one talks to each other, so sometimes you're getting told to do things that counteract what another person is telling you. Is that what you were saying as well?
Yeah, very much so. And for someone with an injury like of yourself, it's really hard to deal with, because you go from one to the other. So who do you believe?
Not just who do you believe, but what do you do?
One of the things I've found is really important is to, when you do find a professional that listens, doesn't matter who it is, you hone in on them, because they will help you. Even if it's not their brief, they will help you find whose brief it is.
Which is why I jumped for joy when you said Barry's name, because he was the first person who ever began to teach me what it meant to live with a brain injury. And I was 22 at that time. So what were some of the obstacles and the challenges that your child faced that related to brain injury during adult years that you can distinguish differences between an able-bodied versus an able-bodied person? Well,
first of all, I've talked about the lack of insight. The lack of insight means that they don't actually see that there is anything wrong. They see it as it happens in their head. And and where they want to go with it, that's what they believe is right. So they're very rigid in their thinking, and so when you're trying to raise a teenager, teenagers are difficult to raise with anyway, and they say having a teenager in the house, or having a brain injury is like having a teenager in the house, and so you're up against it double-fold. So the other aspects are, because they don't understand danger, safety issues, they just see it as control. Whereas with the other children, you could actually negotiate with them, and they would understand that you were trying to do this to be a good parent, to make sure that they were safe. You're putting these boundaries in place, but you would let them do what they could.
How does that relate to them being an adult, though?
Well, what happens is that as an adult, and you've got somebody that fires up as an adult, that's not socially acceptable. And once they hit 16, they can be held responsible for their actions. And so therefore, they can get into the justice system, which in our case happened. Because they don't learn by consequences, So that impacts every single thing that they do. Hopefully that's answered you.
Did you have to step in even later on down the track and be more of a parent than you were to, say, your other child?
Majorly. The hours that I would have spent in the school system, and then further on, even as an adult, even now,
yeah,
I still am contributing in some way, making sure, hoping that, even on a one-on-one basis, that we're getting good, you're trying to sow the seed so that they get to start thinking it's their idea, so I've learned a lot about trying to steer rather than confront as a parent and to try and get some changes in behaviours, I think.
What opportunities out there do you think your child has missed out on as an adult, not a teenager or anything, in life that would have been possible for them if the adequate supports were available?
It's a hard one to answer. I remember very clearly, and I'll hark back to Dr. Barry Longmore. I remember him, it was one of the very first meetings I ever went to when we were living in Dunedin here, saying that whether they are 6, 16 or 60, they will be adapting their life to their brain injury. And that really hit home to me. And I use it a lot when I'm doing education sessions because it highlighted to me at various ages through life this brain injury is still there and still having to be adapted to. So what things weren't available? So a career wasn't available to go down a certain pathway and have a dream and follow that. But then having a good professional psychologist in place certainly enabled them to see that they had some opportunities still and they could develop a life for themselves. May not be in the paid work capacity like we think of, but they have developed a life for themselves.
That's cool. Is there anything that you could have done differently, do you think?
Yes. I could have advocated stronger in the early days to ensure that we got the correct help from ACC. I was not used to having the thought of having to take ACC to court to access services and supports, but we should have done it back then. We did make inquiries, but we never went further.
I take it that's because you didn't have the energy?
We didn't. No, it wasn't. We didn't have the money. Right. And but it wasn't till they were about 17 or 18 that we got awarded 24-hour indirect supervision from ACC, which turned our life around.
Yeah. I guess the last big question I want to ask is, what are the strategies as a parent you've developed to learn how to cope or survive and thrive?
For me personally, it's doing this stuff. Education about brain injury, trying to help others. My role at the Brain Injury Association I've tried to turn a negative into a positive. For my husband, I think he just doesn't want to go there, and so he really doesn't like to talk about brain injury as such. But I think the biggest strategy was education for us as a family, and doing some good out of some bad.
Just before we go, I always remember chatting to you once, and you made me laugh because you were so right. You once said that those of us who were children when we sustained our brain injuries, as we get into our adult years, that we can't lie. Can you explain that to people?
Well, what happens is to tell a lie, you've got to juggle a whole lot of balls and thoughts and bits and pieces. And for a person with a brain injury, they can't do that. So they can't think, oh, well, I'll give this excuse, but then there's a flow-on effect. So they can't just get those pieces together. And it's basic honesty, and they just say it how it is.
Thanks, Cathy. That's been fabulous having you tell us your story. And Cathy Matthews now works as an educator with Brain Injury Otago. If you want to find out more about them, you can check them out at their website. You've been listening to Headstrong, a life with traumatic brain injury. In the next episode, I will talk to New Zealand's top specialist in the field of adult childhood traumatic brain injuries, Dr. Greg Finucane, about the impacts of adult childhood traumatic brain injuries. We'll also explore how secondary ADHD fits in. If you'd like to listen again or hear other episodes of Headstrong, you'll find it at oar.org.nz or your favourite podcast platform. Thanks to Brain Injury New Zealand, Paula Schoenfeld, and especially OAR FM for making this series possible.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.